Staging Shakespeare, a podcast for all those who see William Shakespeare primarily as a dramatist and want to explore ways to stage his plays as live theatre. I'm William Gilbert, and I've been a director and teacher of theatre for nearly 50 years. In that time, I've directed a lot of Shakespeare plays, and I've seen a whole load more in performance. I'd like to share those experiences with you in this podcast as we journey together towards a better understanding of staging Shakespeare. So, let's get started, shall we? Episode 2 of Staging Shakespeare. I'm calling this second episode Fairies with Attitude, because it's all about, well, fairies and the way they present themselves. The fairies I want to consider are the ones in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And rather than concentrate on the fairy king and queen, Oberon and Titania, or the mischievous Puck, Oberon's naughty sprite, I'm going to look at the four named fairies who serve Titania: Peaseblossom, Cobweb, Moth and Mustard Seed. I'm also going to leave the fairy who talks to Puck in Act 2 Scene 1 out of the picture as well. Perhaps this all seems a bit perverse. Why would you do a podcast about the dream and focus on some of the least important characters? Well, hopefully the answer to that will become more clear as we go along. Imagine I'm directing a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is something I've done a number of times, most recently outdoors at Llanthony Priory in Wales. And with my designer, if I can afford one, and that's by no means always possible for those who work in a non-professional context on Shakespeare's plays, I'm trying to find a way of making the play work for a contemporary audience. Probably, just out of historical interest, I'll ask myself this question: what kind of fairies was Shakespeare imagining when he wrote the play in the late 16th century? Even though I'm not going to let that dominate my own approach, I often do start there. I start from where Shakespeare started, because that seems to me a useful thing to do. So, let's have a think about that together, shall we? It's worth reminding ourselves for a moment that Shakespeare wrote plays with a particular acting company in mind. The company known at the time that the dream was written, around 1595 or 6, as the Lord Chamberlain's Men. The Globe Theatre had not yet been built, and they were performing plays at the not very imaginatively named The Theatre in Shoreditch. Now, it's been suggested that the play requires a larger number of boy actors to play fairies than would usually have been available to the company. Remember that no women or girls were allowed to perform on stage on grounds of that being inappropriate and immoral. Now, obviously, Shakespeare's company did have boy players, and these were required to act out the female roles. But even if you double Titania with Hippolyta, you've only got 3 boy players accounted for if you add the diminutive Hermia and the taller Helena to the list. With 4 additional boys as fairies, you would reach 7, maybe 8 if the fairy who talks to Puck is also a boy. 8 boy players just doesn't stack up. So which adult members of the acting company can be drafted in to play Peaseblossom and the rest of the gang? Of course, we know that doubling of parts was commonplace in Shakespeare's theatre. The doubling of Oberon and Titania with Theseus and Hippolyta has become almost de rigueur. So if we look at the distribution of parts, which of the actors are left to play the fairies? The simple answer is the other mechanicals: Snug, snout, starveling and flute. But hang on a minute, you say, shouldn't the fairies be small? Surely it isn't possible for the galumphing comedians who play the mechanicals to reappear on stage as Titania's tiny entourage? The truth is, it's difficult to come to any other conclusion. 3 boy players was pretty much the norm. You need 3, for example, in Hamlet. 1 for Gertrude and 1 for Ophelia, and a 3rd for the player queen, all of whom are on stage simultaneously in the play within a play mousetrap scene. It's unlikely that the actors playing Aegeus or Philostrate would be right for the job of mustard seed and cobweb. So the mechanicals it has to be, minus the actor playing Peter Quince. Wow. As soon as you take that idea on board, Titania's fairies start to take on a whole new aspect. These aren't tiny tots in frilly tutus. These are genuine blokes who have to give a good impression of being Athenian working men elsewhere in the play. And then suddenly you see what Shakespeare is doing with the names of the fairies. It's a verbal, optical illusion. The names of the fairies help us to imagine them as being smaller than the actors really are. Or, and here's a real possibility as far as I'm concerned, the names of the fairies are deliberately ludicrous. Imagine it. On stage, you've got 4 normal-sized male actors, and they're playing characters called Peaseblossom, Cobweb, Moth and Mustard Seed. It's actually hilarious. Instead of the fairies being some twee Victorian balletic nonsense, they're really a bold Elizabethan belly laugh. And that means they fit in perfectly in a play with a character called Bottom, who's currently wearing an ass's head. Now, I will admit that I haven't ever seen a production which has doubled the fairies and the mechanicals. Nor have I done that myself in the ones I've directed. If you've seen anything along those lines, do let me know. You can always email me on podcaststagingshakespeare@gmail.com. But let's leave Elizabethan staging conditions behind now and move on to explore some of the ways that modern directors have responded to the challenge of Titania's fairy band. The problem that faces us recently is, I guess, the suspension of disbelief, as Coleridge called it. Shakespeare's audiences believed in fairies. Well, most of them did, I expect. Probably there were a few atheist skeptics, but in general, the world of the supernatural was one they accepted as a given. They believed in witches too, so Macbeth posed no problems on that score either. But personally, I don't believe in fairies, witches, or the supernatural. Perhaps you do, and that gives you a door into the play that I don't have access to myself. Of course, if I want to get anywhere with a play like A Midsummer Night's Dream, I'm going to have to put those beliefs of mine to one side. I can't direct a play about the king and queen of fairies, including a magic love potion and an ass's head, if I'm simply going to say, these things don't exist. They're fanciful nonsense. So what do? I suspend my disbelief and I go with the flow. Because I love the play, for all kinds of reasons, and so does my audience. Having said that, perhaps I'll just leave the tiny frilly tutus on one side and look for a more gutsy solution. Something with a bit more attitude. Which is just what John Caird did in his 1989 RSC production, which I saw not in Stratford but at the Barbican Centre in London, a venue which at that time was the Royal Shakespeare Company's regular London home. What Caird and his designer Sue Blaine did with the Fairies was to take the traditional balletic look derived from many Victorian-influenced past productions and marry it with a kind of punk rock sensibility. The Fairies were grumpy teenagers wearing Doc Martens as well as strap-on wings and outrageously inappropriate tutus, looking for all the world like the naughtiest girls from St Trinian's who'd been let loose in the RSC's costume cupboard and told to dress up as fairies. The forest itself was like a junkyard, and the whole feel of the fantasy world was as though we had stumbled into a realm that had been slung together by a recalcitrant child who was out to have some really naughty fun and make a right old mess at the same time. And although I did say I wasn't going to spend any time on Puck, I have to say that Richard McCabe was one of the naughtiest and most entertaining Pucks that I've ever seen. The point I want to make here is this. These days, the way you approach the Fairies is a touchstone for how you're bringing the play into contact with the present, with modern sensibilities. And that's a vital part of the art of staging Shakespeare today. Yes, you have to have magic. Yes, Bottom has to be given an ass's head by Puck. Yes, the magic love juice has to sort out the problems of the wrangling lovers. But the Fairies had better kick ass, or the whole thing will evaporate in tweeness. There are some great photos of this production on the internet. And if you didn't see it yourself and you want to get a better idea of what I'm talking about, I recommend that you Google the production and take a look. Of course, costume is only one aspect of Fairies with attitude. Performance is another. And Caird was careful to make sure that his punk fairies were an unruly bunch. They had a tendency to chew gum and look bolshy. They gave the impression they weren't at all ready to make nice. When it came to singing Titania to sleep at the start of Act 2, Scene 2, Caird's fairies made certain to do the opposite of what past productions had led us to expect. Instead of a sweetly sung lullaby, they were equipped with large fly swatters and brooms to see off any approaching mini-beasts. And when Titania asked to be sung asleep, the whole troop groaned, as if they were far too grown up to be wasting time on soppy stuff like lullabies. One of them dropped a pretend spider on Titania, who reacted with a scream, and another sat apart, actually eating an enormous spider during the singing. You could see that they were all a bit of a handful. Later, in Act 3, Scene 1, where Titania is awoken by Bottom's singing, they giggled uncontrollably when the Fairy Queen declared her love for the ass-headed weaver. Watching this production, I was completely won over by this interpretation of the Fairies. In fact, it's become a kind of touchstone for me, and whenever I see a production of The Dream now, I wait for the arrival of the Fairies, hoping that they will have as much attitude as those created by John Caird and his designer Sue Blaine. As I mentioned earlier, my own most recent production of the play was staged outdoors in the ruins of Llanthony Priory, near Abergavenny in Wales. It was very much a community production, so that the actors were drawn not just from my regular group, Suitcase Theatre Company, but from people living in the Llanthony Valley who don't do theatre on a regular basis, but who wanted to be part of this big and special community event. And given those circumstances, it was important to me to have not just adults taking part, but also young adults, playing the lovers, and children playing the fairies. Those of you who create community theatre will appreciate, I'm sure, how vital it is to get people aged from 8 to 80 involved. I had a great collection of kids playing the fairies and a really excellent Puck, though I did say, didn't I, that I wasn't going to talk about Puck. So, did my lanterny fairies have attitude? I'll say so. In fact, what was really great was that as they became more relaxed during rehearsals with the language of Shakespeare and their understanding of the play, they started to find ways themselves of making mischief on stage. They desperately wanted to poke fun at Bottom and have a lark at his expense. In truth, their own innate naughtiness as kids gradually rose to the surface, and my job was to channel that effectively so that it didn't get too out of hand and overwhelm the scenes in which they appeared. I hope that I got it about right. Certainly I think the audiences were charmed and entertained by them. They enjoyed the fairies' cheeky irreverence, which is what I'd hoped for all along. Though it has to be said that at times in rehearsal it was a bit like herding cats. Well, that's it for this episode. If you've directed the play yourself, do drop me a line to say how your fairies were performed. Or if you saw an excellent production where the fairies really stood out as something interesting, then let me know. Or even if you disagree with me and don't like your fairies to have any attitude at all, I welcome any constructive comments on the podcast and the opinions it contains. Do please subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already, so you get to hear as soon as the next episode is ready. They should be appearing on a regular basis, about once a fortnight. And don't forget to give the podcast a rating. If your podcasting platform doesn't allow you to do that, then you can find the podcast on YouTube and you can like it there. And you can also put a comment there, which will be gratefully received. Or, of course, you can email me at podcaststagingshakespeare@gmail.com. I hope you've enjoyed thinking about fairies with attitude. Thanks for listening. Bye now.